So you want to learn jazz improvisation, but you may not know exactly where to start. It's pretty overwhelming if you think about it, especially if you're coming into jazz from the outside. So in today's video, I'm going to break things down, make things simple, and give you 4 steps to learn jazz improvisation. That's coming right up. What's up, Brent here from LearnJazzStandards.com, which is a blog, a podcast, and videos all geared towards helping you become a better jazz musician. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, the bell notification to never miss out on anything going on this channel. Now, I've done lots of videos where I go in depth and show examples and play stuff on my guitar to show you how to do things that will help you become a better jazz improviser. However, today's video is really more of an overview so that you can start taking action on actual strategy. And the 4 steps that I talk about today come right out of my new book, Jazz Improvisation Made Simple. I'll leave a link to that in the description down below, but with thought I'd love to share these 4 steps with you in this video to break things down to make it simple. All right, so without further ado, let's start with step 1. Step number 1 might seem like an obvious starting place, but believe it or not, many people are not really doing this and they want to learn jazz improvisation, and that is you must listen to jazz. Now, I talk about listening in 2 different kinds, one being passive listening and one being active listening. Now, both are important, passive listening being more listening to jazz in the background while you're doing other things in the car or talking with friends, and active listening being you sit down and all you're really doing and focusing on is listening to jazz. Now, you might wonder, well, there's so much jazz to listen to, what should I be listening to? So for the purposes of today's video, I'm just going to break it down to 3 albums I think you should check out. Number 1 is Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 sessions. It's compilation albums. This will really give you a good idea of who Louis Armstrong is, how important he is to jazz, and really, you know, the jazz that was really starting out, the early forms of jazz that launched everything else. The second album is Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie live at Massey Hall. This is just showing you bebop and how important Charlie Parker was and how that language just transformed all of jazz. The third album is Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. This is one that most jazz musicians will recommend. It covers modal harmony, it covers the blues. Of course, there's so many great musicians you can discover after that are in Miles's band, such as John Coltrane, and you just need to know who Miles Davis is. So those are 3 albums I would start with. The most important thing is that you're making listening a regular part of your time with learning jazz improvisation, because indeed, just simply listening to jazz is practicing, and you will start learning the language better. And yes, jazz is a language. Now, step number 2 is to understand the basics of jazz theory. And I want to really emphasize the basics, because a big myth about jazz is that you need to learn all there is about music theory and how complex it is, and jazz is just a complex style of music. The truth is you really don't need to know that much. So when it comes to jazz theory, I would suggest that you know your basic qualities of 7th chords, what they are, how to play them. I would recommend you understand what guide tones are, which are the 3rds and 7ths, kind of the important notes in those chords you want to resolve to in your improvisation. I would recommend you know just the basic scales. I like to boil it down to just 5 scales for each quality of chord, 1 per chord, just to make things simple to start with. And then also your basic chord progressions, which I believe there are really only 4 or 5 that you need to get started out with. Now, just in case you'd like to check this out, at the end of this video, and I'll leave in the description below, I'm going to link to a video that just talks about the only essentials to jazz theory, and I do take out my guitar and walk you through those. So if you find that helpful, stick to the end of the video or check out the list of videos in the description down below. Now, step number 3 is to start practicing what I call the 3 pillars of jazz improvisation. Now, these are really important. I believe through all of my work with students, through myself having practiced hours and hours and wasted tons and tons of time practicing, the 3 things that are really going to move the needle for you in your jazz improvisation are: number 1, technique; number 2, learning jazz repertoire; and number 3, learning jazz language. So when I talk about technique being number 1, I'm talking about things that are specific to your instrument, like, long tones if you're a trumpet player, or, learning your fretboard if you're a guitar player. I'm also talking about things that will help you with jazz improvisation, like pattern playing, so you're flexible with being able to create melodic lines that you normally maybe wouldn't be able to play. Having technique under your hands and fingers is really important so that you can express yourself freely as an improviser. And the second one is jazz repertoire. Now, this is the big one and the big part of my brand, Learn Jazz Standards. When you learn jazz standards, it's going to open up the doors like crazy to understanding the music and learning all the harmonic lessons in them. This is really the key. So you have to start learning jazz standards. If you have no idea where to start, I'm going to go ahead and leave a list of 10 master jazz standards in the description below that I think will help you get started with some standards to start learning. And lastly, jazz language. Now, when I talk about jazz language, I'm really talking about learning it by ear, not so much reading sheet music. Well, that is something that you can do, and it's an important part of learning a language. I really talk about learning jazz language by ear because that's really what's going to get you the most bang for your buck. So when I talk about learning jazz language, I talk about micro jazz language being maybe little licks or small melodic ideas over top of chord progressions. And I'm also talking about learning whole entire solos, macro jazz language, to get a bird's eye view of how a musician approached improvising over jazz standard. If you add a little bit of these things into your practice sessions and you really focus on just these three, you're going to see some serious results. Now, number 4 is by far the most important step that I really want you to pay attention to, because throughout my experience as a jazz musician, and I've gone to play New York City here where I live, bars, restaurants, gigs all over. I've played hundreds of them with some great musicians, and I've taught many students. And the thing that I've found is that without a goal-oriented focused practice plan, you're going to be completely lost. So number 4 is establish a rock solid practice plan. Now, in my book, Jazz Improvisation Made Simple, I do talk about a few different practice plans that I've implemented as frameworks in some of my courses. Now, regardless of if you took one of my courses, you could still take those frameworks and make them work. But the important thing is that you have an actual process. I'll leave a video, a link in the description below of a video where I talk about a practice program that is specifically helpful for learning the blues and really locking down that important chord progression and song form, which will help you with all the rest of jazz improvisation. All right, now just a quick recap on those 4 steps. Number 1, listen to jazz. Number 2, understand the basics of jazz theory. Number 3, focus on the 3 pillars of jazz improvisation: technique, repertoire, and language. And number 4, have a rock solid practice plan to implement all of those things that I just talked about. All right. So what I want to hear from you is, what do you think are the most important things to start learning jazz improvisation? If you were to boil it down to just 4 steps, what would you say are the most important things for learning jazz improvisation? Go ahead and leave those in the comments below. Would love to hear from you. All right, like I said, another video you can check out is the only things you need to do for jazz theory to simplify it. So I'm going to leave that video down below, and you can check that out if you want to check out that further. Of course, if you want to check out my book, Jazz Improvisation Made Simple, it's pretty cheap. It's up on Amazon, and I'll leave that right up here. All right, thanks everybody for listening. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.